towards the end of the message. Um, but I want to do a reflection um, on a piece, a segment of the life of Dr. Martin Luther King, um, as we are in this weekend of celebrating his life and legacy. Um, so allow me to begin this by stating a belief that I have that Dr. King's life and his legacy, his words, his mission and his purpose have been, I believe, deliberately misunderstood. Um, so that particularly people who have not read King extensively or who have read only one or two sermons or speeches of Dr. King believe that his focus was about improving the personal relationships between black people and white people, regardless of the impact of power dynamics. And so people talk about or they critique King, often because of the way that the I Have a Dream speech has been used publicly, the way that it has been used in the mouths of people who have tried to dismantle the safety nets that keep people out of poverty, the programs that make it possible for people to move towards equality, that people who have tried to dismantle those programs have often done so quoting Martin Luther King in ways that he never would have used his own words. And so that deliberate misunderstanding, um, the making an icon, making King to be someone larger than life, has really distanced the King of our cultural and national memory from the person who worked and who advocated for social justice. Um, and so to help kind of recover or lift up the truer essence of King, I want to reflect for a moment on work that Martin Luther King did in Chicago, Illinois, work that is very rarely talked about by anybody because it wasn't one of King's greatest successes. It wasn't a campaign. His campaign in Chicago was not one um, that had sweeping victory or one where there was change. But the campaign that he engaged in Chicago was one of the hardest, most controversial, and one of the ones that had the least amount of tangible positive results afterwards. But it was in 1966. It was after the March on Washington, after King gave the I Had a Dream speech. It was after he won the Nobel Peace Prize. It was after he had been celebrated by so many people for all of the things and the ways that he was moving and speaking throughout the country. It was in the time where the country's opinion of King began to shift and turn, that his popularity began to decline. In 1966, Dr. King's approval rating, they did take approval ratings on people like King. It wasn't just presidents who got polled for their approval ratings, but King's approval ratings in 1966, I believe, was somewhere around 33%. Far from the heights that he had enjoyed when he was celebrated as a national treasure, but also far from the depths it would plummet in 1967 and closer to his death in 68 when it would plummet down to 17%. King was beginning to take a downward dip in his approval ratings. And even there was tension beginning to emerge among the ranks, that there were people who said that because they had achieved some modest gains, because of the Civil Rights Act had been voted and put in place, because the President of the United States was beginning to speak nationally about the need to deal with the race issue. There were people who were saying to King, it's time to take your foot off of the accelerator. It's time to back up off of some of the extreme actions that you are taking. We are now getting our voice into public space. And so we ought to be responsible with our voice in this public space. And instead of being so antagonistic, we ought to figure out now how we can get along just a little while. And King began to be unsettled about this course of action, and conversations that he had with people like Bayard Rustin, or people like Stokely Carmichael, organizers like Ella Baker. Those conversations continued to push King to find the next edge. Where can the work have the most impact? So it was Albert Raby and James Bevel and Diane Nash, who were living and working in Chicago and who had worked with King, and said that you ought to take this work to Chicago because while the work of tackling segregation in the South is critically important, we are also experiencing issues up north. Segregation is not as clearly delineated as it is down south. But there are neighborhoods that are being taken advantage of. There are neighborhoods where Black people are forced to live in, where their standard and quality of living is so substandard that nobody would want to live in, and nothing is being done. There's no attention being paid to this. So if you can come to Chicago and you can convince Mayor Daley of the righteousness of your cause, that could set into motion a series of actions that could radically transform the nation. And so King decided in 1966, he decided to move to Chicago, and they began looking for a place for him to stay. And so supporters offered their houses, or entertainers offered guest houses that they had in Chicago that they would use while they stayed there. Friends of King and of the movement offered to find some of the best, most comfortable apartments for him and his family to stay. But King rejected all of those offers, and he said, if I'm going to go to Chicago and do this work, I need to stay in the places that are the most impacted by this. Mm-hmm. And so he had his team go out and find an apartment for him that was owned by one of the biggest, most notorious slumlords in Chicago. The word is that apartment building did not have a lock on the front door. And so anybody was able to come in and out of the apartment building at will. And oftentimes at night, people who were drunk walking down the street would walk into the apartment building and use the hallway as a toilet. And so that the smell of urine and the smell of feces would be all throughout the apartment. That there was only one light in one portion of the hallway, and so when you walked into the apartment, you had to walk in the dark. And this was a time before there were cell phones and lights on cell phone cameras, so people had no ability really to provide their own light. They would be walking through the hallway in the dark, amidst the smell of the hallway, trying to get to their apartment. The word is that the apartment was in such bad shape that when the apartment owner heard that Dr. King was going to be staying there and understood the national attention that would attract Dr. King, that he immediately sent a crew of people to work to fix up plaster in the apartment, to try to repaint the walls, to do something to make it seem a little bit better. Just because Dr. King was staying there. In fact, it was so funny to his supporters that they jokingly suggested to just have Dr. King move from apartment to apartment throughout the West Side in order to fix up all of the buildings. And so in this move that King does in Chicago, there are, I believe, three things that I want to lift up that are important for us to think about as we think about not just the big work. When we think of King, often we think of the big moments. We do think of the March on Washington. We think of the sanitation worker strike in Memphis. We think of the tragic last moments of his life when he was taken from us We think of these big moments with Dr. King, but it wasn't about the big moments, or more to the point, the big moments would not have been possible if it weren't for the little moments, the daily, regular disciplines that King established, the spiritual practices that help undergird him for the larger work that was ahead. And that's what I want to lift up for us today, is these smaller spiritual disciplines. Because one thing I've learned, friends and family, brothers and sisters, is that the big moments will find us. Yeah. And we don't have to go looking for them. They will come to us and they will find us. The question is, how will they find us? Will they find us ready for them? Will we have been engaging in the spiritual practices that make us ready to step into the big moments when they find us? Or will they find us waiting, looking, hoping that someone else steps up to take on the moment because we are unprepared? So there are spiritual practices that King engages in that I want to lift up before us. The first is that King had a spiritual practice of proximity. That is to say, my brothers and sisters, I believe that the possibility of radical change increases every time we increase our proximity to the people who need radical change the most. Right. Every time we get just a little bit closer to people who need radical change the most, that it increases the possibility that radical change can happen. King practiced proximity. Proximity is what made the bus boycott sustainable, because it wasn't just about the idea that we should boycott buses, but in order to make that possible, somebody had to drive the people who were using buses to work every day. Somebody had to make sure that people were able to get to and from their jobs. And because of the way life in Montgomery, Alabama was structured, most of the people who had work did not work in the communities in which they lived. Most of the people who went to work worked in white communities and worked as domestics in white people's homes. They worked in neighborhoods or communities that were farther away from their own. And so somebody had to make a commitment to make sure that the people who depended on the buses for their livelihood had a way to get to and from work so that they could continue in their regular lives, so they could still make their ends meet, so they could still provide a roof over their head and food for their families, so they could still do the things they needed to do while engaging in the act of resistance. And it was the proximity to the people who needed to use the buses that enabled people to think of the structure needed to make it possible. One of the challenges so often, friends and family, in the conversations that happen today about what is needed is that these conversations happen without proximity to the people who need radical change the most. And so we talk about ideas of what is possible or things we should boycott or things that we should avoid without thinking about what is the structure necessary to make it possible for people who use those systems to be able to engage in their regular lives. People, particularly here in Cincinnati, we talk about how Cincinnati is a food desert, and there have been calls to do things like boycott Kroger or boycott this store or that store, or boycott the places in black neighborhoods that sell food at higher prices with lower quality. But we do not have conversations about how do we help the people who are dependent upon these stores. Right. How do we help them live? What are the alternative means that we can provide? Because if we are going to take something away from somebody, we ought to provide them something to replace it. And so it was proximity that made that possible. Proximity, friends and family, is the key talking point of Bryan Stevenson. If you ever hear Bryan Stevenson talk, proximity is a word that he will use multiple times in his speech because he's grounded his work, his great legal mind, and all of the advocacy he does for people who are behind bars, people who should be freed, people whose punishments far outweigh their crime, or in many cases, people who never committed a crime but never had adequate legal defense in the first place. All of his great legal mind and work, it isn't any of that he leans on. It is the fact of proximity. He says, as we increase our proximity to the people who are in need, that we find ways to use the talents that we have in order to help create communities of justice. That you do not have to have a specific set of skills to be engaged in justice work. All you have to do is be close to somebody who needs change. Proximity is important. My brothers and sisters. And it is one of the things that we are seeking to do more and more day by day as Beloved Community Church, is increasing our proximity to the people who need radical change the most. The community meals that we are engaging in is one attempt that we have in trying to increase our proximity, because we know this intellectually, we know this in our hearts, we know this in our guts, we know that we cannot come to church on Sunday morning and praise God here and go home and that be the end of our Christian service. We know that God calls and requires more of us than that. We know that we need to increase our proximity, and so we are trying to figure out day by day, step by step, how do we increase our proximity to the people in our communities who need radical change the most. That is the first spiritual practice that King engages in that I want to lift up, is increasing our proximity to the people who are the most vulnerable. The second thing I want to talk about is understanding that meeting people's basic needs is essential. It is spiritual work. It is holy work. And it is not all of the work. That we have to address people's basic needs, their physical needs, and also help them to understand the context, the political and economic forces that make their current needs a reality. And so King, who was known for giving speeches, who was known for commanding crowds of hundreds of thousands of people, a king who we remember as standing before people with his great and roaring voice and speaking words of truth to power. King, the first thing he does when he gets to Chicago is not go to somebody's church to preach a sermon. It's not to call a meeting of people to come together. But the first thing he does is put on a set of overalls and grab a hammer and grab some plywood and go out to the people in the community around him and help them to fix up the broken holes in their apartment, to help them to make the places they are staying a little more livable, to help people to increase what is broken around them, to help them to fix it. King and his group of people who are preachers, people who are activists, people who have spent their life working to create political change, the first thing they do is not to engage in acts of not to do political meetings, but the first thing they do is to go knock on people's doors and ask how they can help them to fix up their apartments. Because King realizes that if he does not help people to deal with the things that are most pressing to them, they will not have the attention, they will not have the capacity to be able to engage in the deeper issues. Friends and family, one of the things one of the reasons why I believe that where we are as a country economically is not by accident, but it is by intention, is the fact that people know that as long as people are hungry, it is hard for them to focus on their liberation. As long as people are worried about where they will sleep at night, it is hard for them to think about engaging in political action. If people are concerned about meeting their most basic needs, then it is hard for them to think about how do they organize in order to make the world a better place, because they have so much energy focused on how do I make it from day to day. And so King realizes that if he is going to have enough credibility that anybody in Chicago would come listen to him, it's not going to be because of his reputation. It's not going to be because of his skills as an orator, but it's going to be because he showed up with people and help them to wrestle with the challenges, the mundane challenges, the everyday challenges, the challenges that nobody celebrates or nobody sings about, the challenges that would never get on the evening news or never make CNN. That King and his team had to engage in the work that nobody would lift up except for those who were directly impacted by it in order to gain their trust, to help them to understand the larger work that was happening. And then once he began to develop some trust with the people, the next thing he did was not to march against injustice, but to take one of the buildings and organize the tenants in the buildings. And said, instead of paying your rent to your landlord, pay your rent to the organization. Pay your rent to, and I don't remember what the name of the organization they formed in Chicago was, but pay your rent to this organization. We will hold your rent as a trustee until your landlord steps up to do the work that needs to be done to fix the building. But we are going to take temporary ownership over the building, and we will make the repairs until the landlord steps in to do what they do. And so pay your rent to the org rather than paying your rent to the landlord. The first action that he began to do was engage in actions that went right at the spirit of capitalism, that stopped people from profiting off of work that they were not doing. That was the first thing that King did in Chicago, meeting people's basic needs and using that to help people understand how to engage in political actions of resistance. The last thing that I want to lift up that King does is that King has a spiritual vision to understand that the impact of his work is always greater than he was able to see. And so his friends and family, people encouraged him not to go to Chicago because he didn't know anything about Chicago, to stay out of the north and keep his work going in the south. People encouraged him to do that, but he realized that the impact of his work was always going to be greater than what he could see. And so the summer of 1966 went on, and King had a huge march throughout Chicago, and the people who were unhappy to see King, the racist people who did not want change to occur, came out in droves to try to intimidate King and his followers from marching. And they came out and they threw rocks and stones, and one of the stones hits King in the head and dazes him for a second. He goes down on one knee. It becomes an image that reverberates throughout the country of people in Chicago attacking King, and the turning of the public sentiment against the city of Chicago because of this begins to give them leverage to negotiate with Mayor Daley in ways that they had not been able to before. And King is able to win some modest agreements. Nothing big, nothing fancy, nothing that he himself even feels completely in love with. He is not thrilled by what he's able to win. He looks at it as a modest victory at most. And there were many people who criticized King, who said he never should have come to Chicago. Reverend J.H. Jackson, the president of the National Baptist Convention, USA Incorporated, was one of the people who criticized King, who said King never should have come to Chicago. In fact, the fight between J.H. Jackson and King split the National Baptist Convention. And it was right around this time that King and all of the preachers who were with King were excommunicated from the National Baptist Convention. They were kicked out. We don't believe in excommunication, except for we did it this one time. And they kicked King and all of his followers out of the National Baptist Convention. And it was here, the next year, in Cincinnati, Ohio, that the Progressive National Baptist Convention was formed, as a response to them being exiled from the National Baptist Convention. They came here to Cincinnati to start a new progressive spiritual movement throughout the Baptist Church right here in this city that took place with people like Fred Shuttlesworth and people like L.V. Booth. That happened right here in this city. And so the work that King did in Chicago was seen as not being worth doing. When people criticized, they laughed, they pointed fingers. They said, see, King isn't as good as he thought he was. He didn't have the impact that you thought would happen. People criticized what he did. Except for one thing that happened that they weren't paying attention to when they were laughing and criticizing. One thing that happened that nobody was looking at when they were evaluating the effectiveness of King's work was that all of the work that King had done, engaging with people, meeting people's needs, training people how to do this work, all of that work began to pay off. And so Diane Nash, one of the people who had invited King to come to Chicago in the first place, ended up running for public office, and ended up becoming a representative for the people of Chicago, ended up becoming an alderperson. The first black mayor of a major city was one of the people who sat in the meetings with King and listened to King's strategy and learned how to organize through his work with King. That there was a new wave of political leadership that emerged because of the conversations and the work they had with King that began to change what political leadership looked like in the city of Chicago. The Black Panther Party began to emerge in Chicago from some of the leaders who were there walking with King, and they began to organize against Mayor Daley. My own mother was a member of the Black Panther Party who left Detroit and came to Chicago to protest against Mayor Daley. And one of the few pictures I have of my mother during this time of her life was at a protest in Chicago against Mayor Daley about school segregation. Leadership emerged from this because King went to Chicago. A group of leaders emerged that began to transform the landscape of what happened and what people thought was possible in Chicago. And one of the very direct results of that was that years later, years after King had been assassinated, years after people had stopped talking about him showing up in Chicago, years after that first generation of political leadership had emerged into their prime and most of them had retired and were now sitting on the sidelines, there was a skinny kid with a funny name who began to do some community organizing in Chicago and began to talk to some of these leaders that had been out there and begin to learn lessons from them, lessons that they had learned from King. He began to learn and to apply. He began to understand the need for him, though he had an Ivy League education, to be proximate to the people who were suffering the most. And they said, if you're going to organize in Chicago, it's not going to be because you're a great speaker. It's not going to be because you have great ideas, but you've got to go and knock on people's doors and talk to them about what's happening. And so he learned how to do that work by building and talking with people about what concerned them. That impacted him so much that he decided after he graduated from law school to come back to Chicago and reject offers from law firms to make huge amounts of money being a lawyer, but decided he wanted to spend time with the people working on issues like voting rights, working on issues of economic justice in those communities, and decided ultimately the best way he could do that was to represent people in the State House. And so he ran for State House and became a representative in the State House of Illinois. And then that work, as he began to make change within the State House, he realized that so many of the problems that were happening on a federal level because the federal government was starting to take away money from state governments. And so he saw an opening to run for the U.S. Senate. And so he began to run for the U.S. Senate. And he was running for the U.S. Senate when there was a young preacher by the name of Nelson Pierce, who was a pastor of a church in Alton, Illinois. And so he began to run for the Senate as my pastoral career was beginning to emerge. And so our paths crossed when he came to Illinois, to Alton, Illinois, to the small city on the west side of the state, and needed a place to speak. And none of the churches in the area would let him speak there because they were afraid of the political repercussion if they allowed somebody to speak there. But the church that we had in Alton, Illinois, the people said, "Pastor, we're not afraid if you're not afraid." And I said, "I'm never afraid." And so we opened our doors to let this young political candidate come and speak. And then he won the U.S. Senate and gave a speech on his way to win the U.S. Senate that captivated the nation, the national imagination, and people began to speak about him as a potential presidential candidate. And then in 2008, he announced that he was throwing his hat in the presidential ring. And many of you remember in November of 2008, the day that Barack Hussein Obama was elected as the first black president of the United States. And that happened, friends and family, in no small part because in 1966, Dr. King decided that he would go to a place that he did not know, that he would get proximate to people, that he would begin working on issues that impacted them, not knowing the impact that would happen down the line.
Amen.
But the one small step that he took reverberated in ways and echoed throughout history. In ways that he never could have or would have imagined. I told you I was going to share the scripture near the end of the sermon, and so I want to lift it up now in Philippians chapter 2, beginning at verse 5, that says, "Let this same mind be in you, that was in Christ Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, being born in human likeness, being found in human form, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God also highly exalted him and gave him a name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father." What Paul says in this book of Philippians, quite simply, my brothers and sisters, is that God's self decided to get proximate to people's pain. And so God decides to leave heaven and to come to earth. But not to come to earth in glorious majesty. Not to come to earth with great power and strength. But to come to earth as a human. And not even a human of royal blood or royal descent. Not even a human in the lineage of the royal priesthood. But Jesus, wanting to be proximate, was conceived by a teenage mother who, at the time of her conception, was not yet married. He was born to a family that, upon returning to their homeland to pay taxes, wasn't able to stay at a hotel. And so they were forced to have Jesus in somebody's barn. He was born to a family that had no friends to come celebrate Jesus' birth. And So God sent a birth announcement to some shepherds to come by and pay tribute. That Jesus, when Jesus grew into his ministry, did not make his home in the comfort of the religious political establishment of Judaism. But he walked with people who were thought to be forgotten by God. He walked among the blind and the lame. He made rounds in the places where the lepers gathered. He was known to hang out with people who were considered drunkards. This is with whom Jesus made his home. And in doing so, Jesus met the needs of the people. You remember the story when the people came out to hear Jesus preach, and the disciples said, Jesus, you got to send people away. You've been preaching so long and we don't have anything to eat. There's no fast food out here in the desert. The people need to eat. And Jesus says, sit them down and you feed them. And they said, we don't have enough food, Jesus. We don't have it. We weren't prepared for this crowd. And Jesus took the little bit they had and blessed it and broke it and gave it to them. He met the people's needs. Made sure that everybody had enough to eat, and so much so that there was food left over at the end. Jesus met their needs because he knew that meeting the needs of the people was holy. Jesus knew that he could not with integrity teach people to pray, give us this day our daily bread, if he did not ever give people the daily bread they needed to survive. And so Jesus met their needs. But he did more than just meet their needs, that in meeting their needs, he helped them to understand what was happening larger around them. He helped them to understand that despite what the religious establishment has tried to convince you of, you don't need to go to the temple and give an offering for God to love you. God is with you even right here. The kingdom of God is among you. Despite what the Roman Empire says, you don't have to be a Roman citizen to have dignity and worth. You have value. So much so that you are worth. If you were lying on the side of the road bleeding, that the most righteous thing, the most holy thing that can be done is somebody to come and meet your needs. Rome didn't like what Jesus had to say. The religious establishment didn't like what Jesus had to say. So they conspired together to crucify Jesus. And much like Dr. King, Jesus refused to stop preaching and teaching, even though his life was under threat. Not only that, but Jesus walked into Jerusalem knowing that there was going to be a trap waiting for him. Gathered with his disciples one last time in an upper room and shared with them this last meal, the Lord's Supper. Much like Dr. King's last speech, Jesus, knowing what's going to happen, engages in this last conversation with the disciples. And then they arrested Jesus. They drug him from courthouse to courthouse until they could find one who would hear the farce of the case that they had. They paid witnesses to lie on Jesus. The judges threw out the case time after time, and they kept going until they found a judge who would finally not just hear the case, but would sentence Jesus. And once he was sentenced, the governor of the area tried to overturn it. He said, look, you have a custom that says I can release a prisoner, and so I will release Jesus to you, or I can release Barabbas. I can release this dangerous criminal that's in the stockades. And the people said, we would rather Barabbas. Crucify Jesus. Jesus did not fight. He did not use his royal power to resist, but he submitted himself to be crucified. He hung there on the cross. They hung him on a cross as a message to everyone who would see. This is what happens if you dare try to organize the people to resist what happens in Rome. And they took Jesus off of the cross. He couldn't even afford a burial plot, so he had to be buried in someone else's tomb. They put a rock over the tomb just to ensure that nobody would get in to mess with Jesus' body. But even though they could keep people from coming into the tomb, they were not strong enough to keep Jesus from coming out of the tomb. Because the Bible says, friends and family, brothers and sisters, that early Sunday morning, just about the break of day, Jesus got up with all power in his hands. And just as Rome sent a message through the crucifixion of Jesus, this is what happens when you try to go against the state. God sent a message to Rome through the resurrection of Jesus. This is what happens when you try to go against God's love and justice. You can try to kill my people, but I can bring new life even where there is death, because the power of the state can only go so far. Yes. But the power of God is limitless. King knew this and believed it. And so he worked and preached, and organized, and spent his life because he believed that when he had breathed his last breath, if he had given all he had, that God would take what he had given, and God would use that to help transform the world. Friends and family, brothers and sisters, I want to invite us to do the same. Not that you have to be a martyr. Not that you have to be willing to face an execution squad. But if you're willing to engage in the simple spiritual practices of figuring out how you can increase your proximity to the people who need radical change the most, to get just a little closer. Figure out how we as a community can continue and strengthen our efforts to meet people's daily needs. And not just to meet their daily needs, but to use that as an invitation, as a way of helping people to see the forces that are at work around them. And if we cannot lose hope in doing that, if we cannot be weary in well-doing, because we believe that even if we don't see it with our eyes, that the seeds that we plant in the ground will produce a fruit. Fruit that we may never see, that we may never enjoy, but fruit that has the potential to change the world. If we can practice those spiritual practices, then we will have honored Dr. King. We will have carried out the mission of Jesus Christ. We will have been faithful stewards of what God has given us. Amen. We have a practice here at Beloved Community Church that we call Response to the Word.